In 2003, my father sold off his 65-unit apartment complex and our grandfather's iconic bar and steakhouse restaurant and moved away. And how important is that to the story I'm about to tell you? Well, you'll just have to listen to the story to know that, won't you? So, let's get to it. My grandfather was a man of the world in his days. He even took a bit of a gangster route in his early youth, and that went on for quite a while, until he started focusing more on the business side of things. But from his early days, he had gotten very heavily involved with the mob over the years, ever since his old mob days in Vegas. By the time he had reached the age of 20, Fletcher, my grandfather, was already looking over all the mob ties in Vegas and was even very well involved with the construction of the Hoover Dam. My father also grew up working under my grandfather, learning the family business and managing all 20 properties in South Florida. My grandfather was a pretty strict man, very firm and unrelenting. The years in the mob, dealing with all sorts of men, had made him quite unyielding and severe in his behavior. Over time, he had grown to be the same in his private life too, with his family, especially with my father. Growing up, he was very demanding and strict, so my father grew to not really care for the man and preferred not to deal with him much. Even though my father was in charge of looking over most of the family properties spread around, my grandfather still had the final say about any drastic decisions about them, like selling or buying new ones. But after the death of my grandfather, the responsibility of it all fell on my father's shoulders. My father kept up the business for as long as he possibly could. He maintained it and almost doubled it under his reign. But after some years, he started getting fed up with the stressful lifestyle. By the time the year 2003 rolled in, he was just about ready to let it all go. He was of the notion that it was time for him to retire from there too, and just enjoy his life now along with my mother. So instead of taking over everything, he chose to sell most of it and just get away from all the hassle. One place that he could not bring himself to sell, however, was my grandfather's mansion in Chicago. But still, both of my parents wanted out of all the stressful duties of maintenance of that mansion too. They already bought themselves a high-rise penthouse in South Beach, Miami, Florida, and wanted nothing to do with the old mansion. So, my father decided to pass the family mansion down to me, as a gift, he insisted. I had spent quite some time in that mansion, much of my childhood in fact, and was rather attached to the place, especially as it was the biggest reminder of my grandfather. So I decided to keep the place and make the place a home for myself too. The only issue I faced was, it was bloody huge. The place had 10 bedrooms and 8 bathrooms for God's sake. Far too huge for one person to live in for sure. And I had never been much fond of silence or being alone. I was sure to go insane of loneliness, if not boredom, if I stayed there for longer than maybe a week or so. So I found the solution of this problem by deciding to get some roommates. I asked my old friend from high school, Henry, to move in with me. He agreed right away. Next, I asked my girlfriend Brenda to do the same, and she too agreed, very happily, if I might add, the both of them. I was happy at the prospect too. I was getting my girlfriend to stay with me as well as my closest friend. It was surely going to be a blast for all of us. We got all excited for the move pretty quickly after that and decided to move in there all together. It was a really exciting day for us the day we moved in. It was also that very same day that I wish we would have never moved into that house or even stepped foot into my grandfather's old office at least. I remember as a kid, back in 1985, my parents and I were visiting my grandfather in the hospital just before he passed away. It was definitely a stressful and sad time for all of us, and I don't remember much of what went on then, but one of the scenes I definitely remember, it's still quite fresh in my memory, as if it just happened yesterday. I always wondered why, out of all my interactions with my grandfather, that this was the one that would always immediately jump into my mind at first when I would think of him. We were all in his room then. The doctor had just left after discussing something with everyone. I couldn't remember what for the life of me, but I knew it was something pretty serious. Everyone was in a very somber mood when one of my grandfather's bodyguards stepped into the room. All of our attention quickly snapped towards him, but he ignored us all and quietly walked over to my grandfather, handing him a brown box. He left the room after, just as quietly as he had entered. Grandfather waved my father over to the bed after only the family remained in the room once again, and my father obediently walked over. My grandfather grabbed him by the ear and pulled him even closer to tell him something important by the looks of it.
I've seen some things in my life, son, that I cannot even explain. But whatever, and I mean whatever you do, don't open this box. Hide it away somewhere. I insist, my boy. Lock this up and bury it. Seal it up in concrete if you must.
My father, who never really liked dealing with him on even the best of days, just took the box from him and assured him that he would. I could tell that father hadn't even taken him seriously and thought he might just be hallucinating under his meds to be saying all of that. He was only trying to placate his father and hid it somewhere in grandfather's house. The very same house we had just moved into, forgotten and left alone all this time. It was soon going to be rediscovered by us and brought into the world once again, very soon. We had spent most of the day going through the whole mansion, choosing our own rooms and deciding what was to go where. There was already a library and an office space, but we were also thinking of converting one room into a game room and one into a home cinema of sorts. We were still on the shelf about a home gym, but the prospects looked good. But all that was to come later on. For the time being, we were content with just going through the place and tidying up the stuff that we already had and moving it around where we wanted it to go. That very night, I was making us something to eat. Brenda was cleaning the top of the bookshelf and Henry was sitting on a couch reading a book. All of us were quietly focusing on the task at hand when suddenly the calm came to an abrupt halt. Brenda bumped into a switch on the top of the bookshelf and a secret door opened up from behind the bookshelves.
"Hey, Oliver! There's some kind of hidden room in here!"
she shouted excitedly. The dinner forgotten, I rushed towards them. All of us gathered around the door, ready to get in and see what else lay inside. We were already thinking about what to do with the newly revealed hidden room as we walked in. We had to walk in with the flashlights of our phones turned on so we could see better in the dark. Through all of my years growing up there, I never even knew that my grandfather had secret rooms inside his house. Once inside, we quickly located the light switch and turned on the lights, only to be flooded by what could only be explained as a history lesson or a museum visit. There were a lot of pictures of my grandfather with some very well-known mob bosses of past and present, some colored and some in black and white. Many of the pictures were dated as far back as my grandfather's early teen years when he had just started on the Mafia Road.
Come on, dude! Your grandfather's been a mob figure going back to the 30s, man!
Exclaimed Henry, sounding very impressed by the new information. Brenda picked up an old picture frame and blew on it to get rid of the dust that had settled over it in almost 2 decades of neglect. She hummed in surprise at the uncovered sight.
Damn, your grandfather looks way too young to be involved with the mob,
she added. I joined her in looking over all the pictures spread throughout what appeared to be a study/office of my grandfather, while Henry started checking up on all the knickknacks around the room. He came across a brown wooden box sitting right next to a picture of my grandfather, holding in his hand a bright red rock placed on a handkerchief. Henry moved to pick up the box and proceeded to open it, only to see the same red rock from the picture placed in the same handkerchief right in the middle of the box.
Hey guys, look what I found! Wow, it's beautiful,
he excitedly began, but soon tapered off.
Come on, Henry, don't touch it!
I rushed to caution him. Something in me told me that this was a really bad idea. What? I couldn't really tell. It was just a nagging feeling that told me not to go near the stone and hide it away someplace instead. Henry seemed to not have heard me. He kept staring at the rock as if he was mesmerized by its beauty. He went to pick it up, almost in a trance, and held it up to us, showing off the size,
This is one hell of a rock. I've never seen anything like this before,"
he exclaimed, still in a bit of a daze. Brenda and I moved closer to him, trying to get him to place the rock back in the box, knowing it was definitely something special at the very least. It was definitely a family heirloom of some sort, so I'm sure it was pretty expensive. The rock had started to immediately glow dark red when Henry had lifted it from the box, and that was obviously what caught his attention next, the thought of letting it go and putting it back in the box all but forgotten.
"Look, fellas! It's glowing!"
He practically screamed in excitement. Before we could revel in its glow for long, the rock made a loud pop and Henry quickly dropped the rock to the floor. Brenda and I had gotten confused at the sudden action, but our confusion only lasted for all of 2 seconds. It was gone as soon as we saw blood running down Henry's arm. He fell to the floor in pain, clutching his arm to his chest and screaming bloody murder.
"My arm! I can't feel my fingers!"
He kept screaming and shouting in pain while we stared at the sight, panicking at the sudden rush of blood. There was no time for panicking though. We could clearly see that he was in a lot of pain and needed urgent medical attention, so Brenda and I grabbed Henry and drove him to the hospital. As we were walking him into the ER, a nurse rushed over to us and made him sit in a wheelchair. As they hurriedly took him away, I could see that the color had already left his face, and even his hand had stopped bleeding by then. That did not bode well. Brenda and I were starting to really worry, pacing the corridor outside, until a doctor came out asking us just how Henry managed to hurt himself so badly and telling us that he had already lost a lot of blood. Nothing we already didn't know, but also nothing we could explain to the doctor clearly. We could tell that the doctor didn't believe us when we told him that all that had happened because he touched a rock. He gave us a really suspicious look, but let it go anyway. Soon we were told that they were going to keep Henry for a few days as he needed close observation. We decided to leave the hospital and get some rest for ourselves and come back to the hospital the next day. We could tell that hospital visits were going to become a routine for at least a week or so. The next day, as soon as we woke up, we decided to go check on Henry at the hospital. We grabbed a quick breakfast and hit the road right away. As we were starting to enter the main road, we started noticing something really odd. We hadn't seen anyone out since we had left the house. There were no cars on the road, as well as nobody walking or standing outside at all. Very, very odd indeed. The roads would usually be packed at this time of day, so a completely empty road raised a lot of questions. Brenda and I looked at each other worriedly, wondering what the hell was going on this side of town. The situation continued on even when we entered the main city. Still nothing. So it wasn't just our area that was dead silent, we realized. The whole city was devoid of any and every activity. It was as if the whole world had just stopped or something, and our car was the only one on the highway. Not a very comforting thought at all. Before our confusion could reach a more worrying level though, we started seeing some movement. We could see people coming out in the open, walking around the city. We let out a collective sigh of relief at that, chuckling at our own earlier paranoid thoughts. The relief was short-lived, however. People were out in the open once again, but none of them seemed to be doing anything. Anything but blankly staring into the sky, looking almost dead. And there was still no driving cars around us. We decided to stop our car by the side of the road, just to check and see what was going on and maybe talk to someone about it. The visit to the hospital was quickly put on the back burner. I saw about a half dozen people standing around 100 or so meters away from the road, all looking around aimlessly, and stopped the car. Brenda stepped out ahead of me and started walking towards them as I took my time to park and lock the car before getting out. By the time I got out, she was already near them. She called over to them, trying to get their attention. They all turned their heads towards her, decidedly very creepy, and soon their eyes did not look very empty. Instead, the look in their eyes could only be described as if someone thirsty had just seen water after ages. It worried me, and I sped up to get closer to her. Just as I was about to call her to stop and get away from those people, they jumped at her, all of them. They literally rushed towards her and lunged at her with their arms outstretched and teeth bared. Brenda didn't have time to process, and all of them were on her, scratching and biting her, ripping her apart, limb by limb. I stood there, rooted to my spot, watching my girlfriend getting massacred right in front of me. A shocked and pained gasp left my mouth, and all of them froze, turning towards me as if realizing I was also there. Before they could move, I knew I was their next target. I knew I couldn't get back to the car in time, as I was closer to them than I was the car. The time it would take me to cross over and open the car was too much. I took the other option and started running away from them as fast as I possibly could, and they were hot on my heels. As I kept running, I started seeing other sights in the city, corpses and limbs scattered around here and there, and there were more of the dead-eyed people too that I had taken to calling zombies in my head, and many of them were joining in on the chase after me. I knew that I couldn't run forever, and I was thinking of what to do next to get away from them as I started hearing a booming noise in the distance. Gunshots, my mind supplied. There must be someone alive. That might just be my way out, I thought, and started running towards the loud bangs. I turned around a corner and came across the source of the sound. There were two guys who had somehow gotten their hands on machine guns and were making good use of them. I shouted towards them, asking for help. One of them shot the zombies behind me, and all of us started running together, but it was to no avail. The sounds were also attracting other zombies to us. We got on the main road and saw one guy hanging out of a van, waving to us to hurry up.
Come on now, run!
He shouted at us, urging us to hurry. We must have had over 100 zombies chasing us by that point. The other two guys kept turning and firing off their machine guns at the zombies, but it didn't put much of a dent in them. So many were still following us. We jumped in the van only to see a man with a bullet wound in the back of his head.
What is this? What happened to the driver?
I asked, shocked and panicked.
I'm sorry! I thought he was infected!
The guy replied, just as panicked.
I'm running low on ammo!
Warned one of the men with the machine guns.
We're about to die out here!
Chimed in the other. All the zombies started to surround the van as we desperately tried to start it.